Okay, so our first panel is designed to be sort of a broad view at renewable energy policy from a variety of different perspectives. To moderate that panel, we have with us Todd, who is a professor in the Department of History here. I like to think he's made a move toward the future. He used to be at the University of Houston with that old school type stuff. Now moving to Iowa, we've got wind and biofuels and more, where the energy is going in the future. So, Todd.
Thank you, Pete. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for showing up. I'd like to thank the Public Policy Institute and everyone involved for doing the heavy lifting to organize this conference. I think it's a great event. We've got a very nice lineup of experts and scholars for you this morning on this panel. I will introduce them individually as we invite them up to the podium. Just wanted to say one thing about the topic, very briefly. This is a very important subject, energy. We all know that. That's why you're all here. The energy sector globally accounts for about $6 trillion of the world economy. So that gives you an idea of the magnitude of the challenge, and over 80% of that is fossil fuels. We are perhaps on the cusp of a transition, and it would be the third energy transition that human civilization has made, from wood and biomass to coal to hydrocarbons and perhaps to some new kind of renewable energy future. The difference is that this transition would be the first one that would not involve carbon. The way it's envisioned is that we will be moving from a high carbon to a low carbon or no carbon future, and so the challenges are immense, and we have a panel of experts here that's going to maybe talk about what the first stage in that transition might look like, and the question is, what is the likely future of renewable energy policy? And our first speaker is Dean Crist, who's the Vice President of Regulation at Mid-American Energy Company. He's been with Mid-American for more than 20 years. His responsibilities include oversight of regulation and legislative affairs groups, input on regulatory and legislative strategies, coordination of rate-making efforts for the company, and prior to his current position, Mr. Crist was responsible for the financial and operating performance of Mid-American's generating and transmission assets. He has also managed the gas and electric wholesale trading operations for Mid-American. So we welcome Mr. Crist. Thank you.
I always have to adjust the microphone. That introduction always kills me because somebody always said, Dean, I guess they couldn't find a job you could do. So I want to talk about, I'm going to go through my slides pretty quickly, and I apologize for that, but they want us to keep to a certain time limit, so we have plenty of time for question and answers. But I want to kind of break it into three parts. One is, what is Mid-American Energy and our holding company doing on renewables? How have we gotten to that large a percent of renewables? What the public policy around renewables has been in Iowa, and what good public policy how that will lead to more renewables, and we'll talk a little bit then about the future that we see as well. This is the Berkshire Hathaway Energy. That's our holding company that Mid-American Energy is a part of. It shows all our various businesses from other electric and gas utilities, as well as pipelines, independent power producing, and we, a few years ago, have a company called Mid-American Renewables. And if you focus down in the southeast part of, or southern part of California, on this chart, it shows our renewable generation as a holding company. One thing I wanted to point out before going on there is we're a company and a holding company that believes in renewable energy when it can be done at an economical basis with reliability and safety as its forefront. And we think by having good public policy, we can get to those pretty significant percentages of renewables. Note that the holding company today has about 28% of its owned and purchased generating capacity of renewable. And we'll show you on this next slide here. I'll talk about the blue triangles are wind that the holding company owns. The orange are solar, and there's various other geothermal. But we'll just to have time to talk about just a couple of them. If you look in Southern California under the what is gold or orange, those are two of the largest solar farms in the world. In fact, one that just got completed, Topaz, is the largest single operating solar farm in the world that was just completed by our renewables group. Right next to it is another orange one that when it's done, it will be the largest solar farm in the world of over 550 megawatts. So from a renewables group, we own 7,500 megawatts of renewable generation in our corporation, and a lot of it is solar and wind. So let's talk about a little bit about Mid-American Energy. And of those of you that have been in Iowa and driven around the countryside have seen the wind turbines. Not every one of them is ours, but most of them are. Here's the location of our operating wind turbines in the state. We own about 3,300 megawatts when all construction is completed, and we poured in over $7 billion in wind in this state. The lighter colored counties are projects that we have currently operating. The red is expansion that we announced, a $1.9 billion expansion last year that is under construction. All except the one to the northwest part in Iowa, those red ones that aren't in that location will be completed by Thanksgiving or very early in December of this year. The one in northwest Iowa in O'Brien County will be completed in 2015 when certain transmission is being done. There's two blue additions on that map, and you might have heard Governor Branstad announce that project here a week ago, last Monday. In completing the construction on these projects in the red, we found additional projects that could be done and still qualify for the production tax credits. So we announced a 162 megawatt addition to our wind family here just last week. One will be a new project in Adair County, that's in the southern part of Iowa, and the other will be addition to the Highland Park in O'Brien County in the northwest. $280 million, and as I say, once we're done, we'll have about 3,300 megawatts. Well, why do we do wind power? And then we'll talk about public policy. Environmental compliance, customer pricing, economic development, fuel diversity. Let's talk about economic development just for a little bit. Land payments. We rent land from farmers. We lease land on long-term leases. It's a huge cash crop for them. Farmers are more likely to say, can't I have more turbines and less turbines on our land? We do extreme amount of customer and landowner relationship to make sure that they're happy with us because we're going to be there a long time. Jobs on construction and permanent jobs, job manufacturing. The governor in this state loves to talk about all the jobs created by renewables, and I'll challenge you, if you drive on Interstate 80, if you don't see a wind turbine blade on it, you're probably not on Interstate 80. So a lot of jobs have been created. You talk about environmental compliance, and that's a huge issue for us as a utility that owns various types of generation. And with the wind generation that we've been building since 2004, we actually have turbines that are going to have their 10th birthday here in December. Our carbon intensity has been driven down over time. So the chart shows from 2000 to 2013, the green is wind, the blue is coal, and the yellow is nuclear and other. We own 25% of a nuclear plant in Illinois. So you can see as wind has been increasing, our carbon intensity has been decreasing, and it puts us in very good position to meet future environmental regulations. But what has it done to cost? And I think this is the key. We're not going to build renewables just to build renewables and hope that our customers can pay whatever it is. What we do when we look at every project is a project has to pay for itself over the life of the project, so it has to bring more benefits than costs. And by doing that, we've been a low-cost energy provider. Our electric rates are 40% lower than national average, way below the regional average, and the white bars are our competitor investor-owned utilities. By having this low-cost energy and having renewables, we've attracted a lot of manufacturing and other types of jobs to the state of Iowa, and to our service territory, not least of which has been the Google, Microsoft, and Facebook additions recently. Well, what about fuel diversity? We're a company that believes you can't put all your eggs in one basket, so you need a diverse fuel mix. If you look at 2000, we had 70% coal. Fast forward to 2016, and this is before the new project we announced last week, will be about 39%. With the new project, we'll be at 40% of our generating capacity will be wind. If you take all the energy that all that wind can produce, that would mean we'd be supplying our retail customers with 50% of their needs coming from wind. So we think we've done a good job on diversity and positioned our customers well in terms of economic development. You know, I always say when the state does well economically, Mid-American will do well, and we need to do our job to keep our costs low and build the type of generation they want. Well, how did we get to be a renewable energy leader? Iowa really experienced the lost decade or decades in the 1980s and 90s when policies really prohibited renewable generation to be built by having two tenets. One, utilities could not own, and there was a high mandated price that we had to buy. And the state set a mandate of about 150 megawatts. Well, policymakers, regulators, utilities got together and said, this isn't going to work. If we really want to encourage renewables, what do we need to do? So there are a lot of policy changes that allow the utilities to own and operate generation. There are also the state changed how we compared renewables from a least cost standard to a reasonable cost standard. That sounds probably a simple thing to do, but if you're going to compare it on a least cost standard, wind would not win, and we would not be regulatorily allowed to build wind. So that was an important change. We also, the state developed a policy where we can go to the state, just like we did with this recent announcement, and say, here's what we want to build, tell us if it's prudent, and tell us how it's going to be treated in rates. So before investing $1, we know exactly how that project is going to be treated in rates, and that took that created an incentive for utilities to create, to build. I think they've covered. I'm trying to stay within my time limit here. Well, let's talk a little bit about, well, let's back up a second. Yep, okay. Let's talk a little bit about the future of renewable energy. You've seen what we've done. You've seen how public policy has changed, how good public policy can drive renewable investment, and that's what we're looking forward to in terms of the new interest, especially in solar and distributed generation, both of which we believe can add value to the resource mix. And we've seen we're a world leader in solar generation. So we know a lot about it, and we believe in it when the costs are right and when the economics make sense for our customers. So while we're both committed to both solar and wind in development, we recognize that different regions of the country require different solutions in terms of renewable. It does no good to put a wind turbine up in a low wind state. It does no good to put solar up in a state or in an area that has low solar intensity. Costs will prevent that, and it won't be good for anyone, either pro or against renewables. So while wind has worked out well, the projects that, we've looked at large solar projects in the state of Iowa, gaining from our experience of our larger company. But let's take the 162 megawatt wind turbine project we just announced. To get the same amount of energy out, we'd have to build a 330 megawatt solar project. Wind would require 70% less capital, 50% less in operating costs, and require 1,650 fewer acres of land, which is critical in an agricultural state. So large wind projects in Iowa don't seem to make sense at this point. In addition, we've done some analysis on solar rooftop and the current costs of solar, and given our rate structure, the various tests are on that. But if you look at just even the bottom one, our electric rates to residential customers would need to increase by 50% for a solar rooftop to be economic for a customer. And that's assuming a net metering scheme that we have here in Iowa, where a rooftop owner can offset their own use by the production of solar and avoid even paying for transmission distribution costs, which others would have to pick up. So even with that subsidy from other customers, our rates would have to go up, or installation costs would have to go down by 40 to 75%, depending on if you had net metering involved. So we think the key to distributed generation will be a balanced policy where customers who do not have the opportunity to install generation are not subsidizing those who do. The Iowa Utilities Board has an inquiry and process on distributed generation. We're going to be at the table trying to bring solutions, balanced solutions, and working towards solutions that we hope will address the state need for renewables. So I think as we look for the future of renewable energy, we're certainly, as you can see by corporation and by the company, we're heavy investors in renewable energy. We think the good policy example of wind, how bad public policy prevented renewables from being built for a long time, good public policy resulted in all this wind that we have in Iowa. Same thing can be done for distributed generation and solar if we keep in mind three things. Customers' costs, they got to be able to afford the energy. You got to have something that attracts economic development and jobs. Reliability, we got to have a high reliable, especially some of these customers that are coming to our service territory require high reliable generation and safety. So with that, moderator, I'll turn that back over to you, and thank you very much. Look forward to the questions.
Pleasure to invite our next speaker up to the panel, our very own ambassador in residence at the University of Iowa, Mr. Ron McMullen. Ron is currently the University of Iowa's ambassador in residence, and has served as the U.S. ambassador to the state of Eritrea. He has more than 30 years of diplomatic experience in the U.S. Foreign Service, has lived and worked and traveled in 96 countries. He has been a visiting professor at the Military Academy at West Point, where he taught international relations and comparative politics. He's also been a diplomat in residence at the University of Texas at Austin. Is the author of many scholarly works and a 3-time recipient of the State Department's Superior Honor Award. He's a native of Northwood, Iowa, and holds a PhD in political science from the University of Iowa. Welcome, Ron.
I'd like to apologize in advance. I need to sneak out at about 10 to 11 to go teach a class on Middle Eastern politics in Schaefer Hall. So I hope to be able to answer questions and then get to my class on time. In the evening, one evening in 1989, I found myself drinking beer and eating beans with 7 Peace Corps volunteers in Bitam, Gabon. Bitam is in the corner where Gabon and Equatorial Guinea and Cameroon come together. It's the back of beyond. It was the middle of nowhere. I was the economic commercial officer in Embassy Libreville, the capital of Gabon. At that time, Gabon was a member of OPEC and produced lots of oil. So I had taken the Peace Corps volunteers' mail, and my wife had sent along a package of Snicker bars for the Peace Corps volunteers, who were mostly math and science teachers up in this very isolated northern region of Gabon. And I said, if you want to meet me at the local dive restaurant, and I'll buy you beer and beans and deliver your mail, and you can tell me how life's going in northern Gabon. And so I got there, gave them their mail, and we were eating beans, and they said, what's happening in the real world? And I said, well, there's been some remarkable news from Utah. These 2 guys believe that they've created cold fusion basically on a tabletop experiment that potentially heralds virtually free electricity for the world. This was during the 2-week window before they realized it was a measurement error, but for a moment, for that one fortnight in 1989, the future of cold fusion got lots of people excited. And these Peace Corps volunteers, I said almost nothing for the rest of the evening. These 7 Peace Corps volunteers talked about how free electricity, or virtually free electricity, would change international politics and international economics. If you had unlimited free electricity, you could convert salt water into fresh water and have hydroponic farms in the middle of the Sahara Desert. And it just went on and on and on like that. And I was so disappointed when we got the news later that this was a measurement error that these 2 guys in Utah had come up with. And yet it got me excited to think about how energy and the structure of international relations, international politics are so closely intertwined. So I'd like to talk a little bit about politics. And public policy is made by politicians whose first objective is to get elected, and their second objective is to get reelected. So all of our talk about, gosh, wouldn't it be great if, needs to be rooted in the notion that public policy is made by politicians. And we in Iowa are privileged to have an inordinate influence on who becomes the chief public policy maker, the U.S. president. I would guess shortly after November 4th, we are going to see more and more potential presidential candidates stopping in at Hamburg Inn to visit with us. Most presidential candidates form a council of foreign policy advisors, often staffed by former ambassadors like me who think that they can provide some insights to the candidate and perhaps get one of the 6,000 plum jobs from the Plum book in the new administration in exchange for providing sage policy advice during the campaign. So I've written a short memo here of 10 points, and the scenario is if Secretary Clinton had formed a foreign policy advisory committee thinking about how Iowa plays a leading role in nominating candidates for president, how she got third in 2008 in Iowa, and how Iowa's interest in renewable energy, particularly biofuels and wind, might play into her policy formulation for her presidential run. So this is a memo that I would perhaps write and discuss with perhaps a former colleague who asked me for some input to Secretary Clinton's policy formation stage as she contemplates another run for the presidency. So this is what I might say about foreign policy and particularly energy policy as a component therein. Number one, last year the U.S. spent $84 billion importing crude oil from 15 countries listed as not free by Freedom House. This $84 billion is about twice the total amount the U.S. spends annually on diplomacy, promoting democracy and human rights, and on all foreign humanitarian and development assistance. Our oil imports from these 15 particularly repressive regimes sustains tyrants who abuse the human rights of their citizens and undermine any chance for democracy in their countries. Due to the politics of rentier states, our oil imports do no good for many common people in authoritarian oil exporting countries. Second, one of the main U.S. national security interests is maintaining the free flow of strategic resources like oil to international markets. The U.S. does not aim to corner the markets of these resources for its own use, but as prices of globally traded commodities affect the United States, a severe disruption in supply could cause substantial economic problems here at home. We saw oil prices quadruple following the Arab oil embargo of 1973, and more than double after the oil shock of 1979 surrounded the Islamic Revolution in Iran. This year, the U.S. Department of Defense's budget is $496 billion, and the Middle East remains a major focus. The United States, for a variety of reasons, bears a disproportionately heavy burden of sustaining Middle Eastern stability. Seeking to preserve access to the region's vast supply of oil is only one of several reasons, but it is a very important U.S. strategic interest in the Middle East. 3, the Iraq War was mainly about misplaced, as it turned out, concerns about the conjunction of weapons of mass destruction and terrorism. Pakistan and North Korea might raise similar concerns, but they lack oil resources of Iraq and its immediate neighborhood. The direct cost of the Iraq War to the United States was $815 billion. The future medical cost of wounded veterans and interest on the money borrowed to finance this war will raise the total amount to over $1 trillion in coming years. The human costs, 4,422 Americans killed and 31,926 wounded, was even greater. 4, militant Islamism continues to undermine stability in the Middle East and threaten U.S. interests and values in the region and beyond. Terrorism and conflict in Syria, Iraq, Libya, Yemen, and Algeria could continue for years and could easily spread to Jordan, Lebanon, and even Saudi Arabia. Iran remains a rogue state supporting terrorists and bent on developing an opaque nuclear industry. Elsewhere, militant Islamism in northern Nigeria is morphing into a major threat to this important oil-producing country. In Venezuela, the highly incompetent regime, whose motto seems to be "Blame America First," is headed for more instability, conflict, and uncertainty. Venezuela trails only Canada, Saudi Arabia, and Mexico as a source of crude oil imports for the United States. 5. America's strategic pivot to East Asia has been delayed for several years as U.S. foreign policy seems mired in the troubled Middle East. A key element in strengthening ties to East Asia and the Pacific is the comprehensive Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade and Investment Agreement, currently stymied by Japanese agricultural protectionism. The TTP excludes China, much to Beijing's chagrin. The People's Republic is said to be contemplating a comprehensive East Asian free trade zone built on existing agreements with the 10 ASEAN countries and the addition of others in the region. This Chinese carrot is paired with the stick of China's increasingly aggressive behavior in maritime disputes in the East China Sea and the South China Sea. As we remain focused on the Middle East, China is eating our lunch in East Asia. The outlook for the Trans-Pacific Partnership remains highly uncertain, while China is now the ASEAN region's leading trading partner. According to the IMF, last month, China surpassed the United States as the world's largest economy based on purchasing power parity. 6. In short, our strategic pivot to East Asia is hampered by our continued efforts to police the troubled Middle East, source of much of the world's exported oil. Our need to maintain the flow of Middle Eastern oil to world markets has proven to be very expensive in terms of treasure, blood, and opportunity costs. Growing instability in the Middle East, Nigeria, and Venezuela could significantly disrupt the American economy, still dependent on oil from these countries, absent a forceful U.S. role. Meanwhile, China is forging ahead in East Asia, cementing trade relationships across the region, while we fail to conclude the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Have we blown it? Maybe so. But what if we were less dependent on imported oil from unstable regions? Could we reduce our military spending, stop deploying our young men and women to be the gendarmes of the Middle East, and stop financing corrupt dictators? Could we rebalance our foreign policy focus on East Asia and the Pacific, the area of our most important challenges and opportunities in coming decades? 7. The North American Free Trade Agreement of 1994 may be part of the answer. Linking the United States, Canada, and Mexico, NAFTA has helped create the world's largest trading bloc. Canada and Mexico are our largest and third largest trading partners and first and third largest sources of imported crude oil. In 2012, the U.S. imported 1.2 billion barrels of crude oil from our NAFTA partners and 1.6 billion barrels from the rest of the world. 8. We propose that the Clinton administration announce shortly after Inauguration Day that the U.S. is imposing a $10 a barrel import fee on crude oil imported from sources outside of NAFTA. The NAFTA treaty's source of origin regulations will discourage Canada and Mexico from the wholesale importation of oil to re-export to the U.S. This $10 import fee will go up $10 a year for the next 4 years, thus increasing the price of non-NAFTA oil by $40 a barrel at the end of President Clinton's first term. Number 9, what would be the effect of this $40 a barrel fee on non-NAFTA oil? Fuel prices for American consumers would rise. Producers in the NAFTA region would see higher demand for their relatively less expensive oil. Non-NAFTA producers would see American demand fall for their relatively more expensive oil. Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Russia, and other non-NAFTA producers would find their revenues reduced, as the world market price of oil is likely to fall if the world's largest importer, the United States, is no longer importing as much from the general global market. Tyrants who depend on oil revenues to fund their coercive and corrupt regimes may be at risk if they don't change their ways. With the rising price of oil in the United States, renewable biofuels such as ethanol and biodiesel would also become more profitable. Demand for Iowa corn and soybeans used in biofuels would increase. Technological refinements in grain-based biofuels and real advances in cellulosic ethanol production could ensue, fostered by increased demand and further research and development. Number 10, but wouldn't Americans object to paying more for oil? Not if half of the import fee revenues were returned to American taxpayers as a special tax credit, and the other half being used to overhaul Veterans Administration hospitals to ensure our veterans of the Iraq War and other wars get the best care possible and to promote renewable energy. Further, the United States would no longer have to police the Middle East to the same degree as in the past, permitting a substantial reduction to the Pentagon's gargantuan budget. A 10% reduction in the annual DoD budget would save taxpayers the same amount as annual U.S. spending on diplomacy, promoting democracy and human rights, and on all foreign humanitarian and development assistance combined. Even better, less dependence on Middle Eastern oil would mean fewer American men and women in uniform being asked to risk life and limb to maintain the flow of oil to global markets. So this is what I would tell Secretary Clinton's Foreign Policy Advisory Committee about international energy policy. If I were to write something for Governor Christie, it might be slightly different. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Mr. Todd Foley, who's the Senior Vice President for Policy and Government Relations at the American Council on Renewable Energy, or ACORE. Mr. Foley handles strategic integration of policy development, research, and external communications, and interaction with federal and state government and regulatory officials. He has over 25 years of experience in federal and state policy, renewable energy market design, business development and sales. Prior to joining ACORE, he was with BP Solar, where he directed global and U.S. policy, communications, and business development. And prior to moving into BP's renewable business, he directed U.S. environmental, government, and regulatory affairs for BP America. He's also served in several U.S. government positions, including the White House, U.S. Senate, U.S. EPA, and OSHA. Welcome, Mr. Foley.
Good morning. Pleasure to be here. ACORE, just so you know a little bit more, is a member-based organization. We have 400 plus members in the renewable energy space, manufacturers, developers, financiers, end users. As we say, all the necessary elements for the success of renewable energy. So our members include, manufacturers like GE, SunPower. We also have important developers in this space, wind, solar, and other technologies. Our members also include the leading financiers in the space, and companies like Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Citi, Bank of America, and users of energy, Google and others. A number of utilities are also our members. So it's bringing the whole sector together to advance the renewable energy agenda going forward. I won't go into too much on all this. This has been a great discussion already this morning and beginning last night. My takeaway is that, and I think I've known this, but what I think we're coming to here is that renewable energy is very much fundamentally a part of the solution to our nation's energy requirements as we go forward. When we think about the importance of fuel diversity, when we think about the challenges our economy faces in terms of growth and the reliable fuel supplies going forward, I think renewable energy is part of that. We're very much part of American energy independence. It's harnessing our abundant natural resources we have here. Some have described the U.S. as the Saudi Arabia of renewable energy, and Iowa is a good example of that, given the tremendous resources here in the area. And it's also, so it's very important for our energy security, our economic security, and of course our environmental security, as we've touched on, whether it's a concern for global issues like climate change or even air quality, ambient air quality. So, and I think as Professor Jacobson put it last night and again this morning, it really is a function of policy. You know, the technology is now cost competitive in most markets, and it works. The capital is there in the financial markets. The issue is, what is the policy signal to the market about where we want to take our energy future going forward? So, great discussion already. I'm reminded, and the professor raised, you know, the Arab oil embargo. You know, 1973 was a very important period because just last year we celebrated the 40th anniversary of the Arab oil embargo. The Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, who was leading much of our reaction to the Arab-Israeli conflict that resulted in the oil embargo, spoke last year, and he noted that it's very important to, you know, continue momentum in development of our alternative and renewable energy resources. As he, you know, that period in 1979 with the Iranian crisis drove a lot of what is happening. My mini bike prices went up from 35 cents a gallon to more than $1. I remember that as a kid. But remember those long gasoline lines? That really focused the country on developing policy and alternatives and going forward. Thomas Edison, you know, has a great quote here many, many years ago. Interestingly, the regulatory framework that we have governing our power sector, he would very much recognize. It's some 140 years old. That's an issue as we look at our future renewable energy policy. So what I'd like to do is walk you through about some, you know, the good news in the renewable energy sector, I think why we're part of the solution, to help set the context for a discussion on the future of renewable energy policy. This is the wind capacity growth. I think no surprise here, Iowa is very much a leader, especially as Dean laid out the leadership of Mid-American here. I actually refer to you guys a lot because when your announcement last year to deploy another gigawatt, 1,000 megawatts of wind in Iowa, because, as you said publicly, it was the cheapest energy source out there, cheaper than natural gas, cheaper than coal. And what's more, it was going to reduce rates for Iowa consumers. That's an amazing story when you think about it. So wind is dramatically growing and has grown. It's about 60 gigawatts now here in the U.S. The point at the bottom is in 2013, 37% of all new power added in the United States came from renewable energy, according to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. The year before, it was 49%. Natural gas is up there in that range as well. The point is, this suggests a scale, a potential for going forward that is quite dramatic. And just to add in there the solar as well. Solar is another one that's really growing, a market that's growing quite dramatically. Interestingly, it's utilities that are some of the biggest deployers of solar and wind power. Mid-American, NextEra, and a couple of others are really doing a lot to drive renewable energy because it's cost competitive, because it's reliable, because it makes sense. I'm just going to fly through these slides. There's too many, but as a result of, you know, what's really happening is that the capital is out there as well. These charts show the investment in the renewable energy sector. About $350 billion has been invested in U.S. renewable energy since 2004, and it's almost $2 trillion globally. So, you know, these are real industries. There's a serious investment. There's some serious players in this space. Mid-American's a good example of that. So this industry has matured. It is competitive. It's a real business as we go forward. Again, we want to talk about policy. How do we tap into these resources? And of course, the industry continues to do its part. The industry has done amazing work to reduce costs. Wind is down 40% in cost since 2008. Solar is down about 85% in cost since 2008. And of course, the industry continues to work on this. As we've talked, Professor Jacobson talked about the Lazard levelized cost analysis of renewable energy. This is actually 2013. The new numbers that came out just a couple of weeks ago are even better than this. You know, wind is the cheapest solution out there right now. It's cheaper on a levelized basis, unsubsidized, next to new gas and new coal. And solar is right there on large utility scale. So, you know, these technologies are cost competitive. They work. Where do we go from here? I think this is a great slide because, I don't know if we have this arrow, but the serrated lines, the orange is wind, the blue is wind, the orange is solar. It shows you the amount of cost reduction solar and wind have achieved actually in a pretty short period of time. And if you look at the blue and the gray, the lower left, that's the cost reduction of gas and coal. And the solid lines are the volumes of these resources applied in the market. The high one being, the largest one being coal generation. The point really is here, look at the dramatic cost reduction in a much shorter period of time relative to the other energy resources. And there, we've crossed that line at the bottom lower right. The interesting point here is, and you can hardly see these two lines at the bottom, the orange and again the blue, that's the volume of solar and wind in the market. Renewables are only about 15% of total U.S. generation. Solar is still about less than 1%. Wind is around the 5% and moving through that. So the costs have come down on these technologies dramatically without much volume. These actually are these technologies are actually scaling up, so the volume is even going to go up higher. Costs are going to continue to come down. EIA just released its average annual electricity rates for the United States. It's now 12.3 cents a kilowatt hour. That's high, and that's going to continue to go up on the conventional energy side, despite even the lower natural gas prices that we see at the wellhead, because that's not what we pay in the market. That's not what we pay at the retail level. That has a downward pressure, but those costs are still going up for lots of other factors as they bring those resources to our homes and our businesses. So anyway, the industry, it was mentioned, I think, Dean, you also mentioned that solar needs to come down a bit, not quite as competitive. The good news is Germany is installing solar at half the cost of what we're installing it for here in the United States. And it's already cost competitive here in the United States. It shows you that we have much more room to reduce costs, and a good example. So, for instance, right now, if you bought a solar on your home in Germany, it's $2.30 a kilowatt hour. In a watt, that is. In the U.S., it's still a little over, generally about $4. And the issue is, it's not the panels. The panels are now a cheaper part of the system. It's all the connected costs, the sales costs. It's the permitting, the time it takes to install on a home, the labor costs. Those are all soft costs that are continuing to come down as the industry tries to improve its cost structure. So the good news, again, those costs are still coming down, and yet we're competitive now. But the issue is the policy, and this is what we'll touch about this and close. In Washington, we all see what's going on there. Renewable energy is in the middle of it. When you think about the tax credits that they've expired, they've been extended, then they've expired again. The renewable energy tax incentives are temporary. They require renewal, and it's hard to get Congress to agree on anything these days. The conventional energy resources, and it was talked about last night, the gentleman from the Manhattan Institute and Professor Jacobson, there's a long list, about 14 conventional energy tax policies that are permanent and deep in the code. They don't face renewals. It's a natural gas production tax credit. It's the oil and gas depletion allowance. There are a lot of policies that are in the code that don't require renewal. The PTC, as we all know, expired at the end of last year. There's a change in language last year to allow it to apply for about a year and a half or so, because you had to commence construction before the end of the expiration of end of last year. So anyway, we've got some issues here, but I'm always reminded, I love Winston Churchill, a great hero of mine, and he commented on our U.S. political system. Take a look at that. I think it's really, really funny, and how appropriate to describe what's going on in Washington. And just the last thought here on policy, and we'll look forward to the discussion going forward. Policy is one of the most highly regulated, policy-oriented sectors of our life, not just our economy. It's not about a free market. Thomas Edison was, the railroads were given land grants to bring coal to use to generate power. These industries are a function of policy. The market's a function of policy. The issue is, in a market of policy and regulation, what are the right signals so that we promote competition and the objective of that we've all been talking about here. So that's very important to note. Again, you think about the permanent tax credits for conventional energy. There's another one. There's the RPS, as we all know about. But I wanted to talk about this master limited partnership issues. Just to close with this because it's a great example. MLPs. One of the reasons why we are enjoying as a nation this natural gas boom is this MLP status. It stands for Master Limited Partnership. It's a tax-treated partnership to promote investment in the extraction industries. Renewable energy by law does not qualify. It does for most renewable. They did change it a few years ago to allow some biofuels and alternative fuel side, but not on the power side. This is a huge, about $600 billion capital market that has actually been the source of the financing for much of the oil and gas boom that we've seen. But renewable energy on the power side does not qualify. So this is just another example, I think, of the opportunity to shape policy, to ensure a competitive and fair playing field. And when we do that, these cost benefits that I've talked about renewable energy, and in addition to the other benefits, the lower impact on the environment, the jobs opportunity, the independence that it provides. You can put solar on your home, generate your own power. These are amazing, market dynamics that are being made possible by the development of these technologies. So I'll stop there and look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
And our final speaker on this panel is Dr. Peter Grossman, who's a chaired professor of economics at Butler University. Dr. Grossman has been publishing on energy and energy policy issues since the 1970s. And most recently, his book, which came out with Cambridge University Press last year, called U.S. Energy Policy and the Pursuit of Failure. It was endorsed by Nobel laureate Thomas Schelling, who called it the Energy Book of the Year on a popular blog. I recommend the book highly to everyone in the audience. It will give you a little bit of a different perspective than we've seen so far, but whether you agree with Dr. Grossman's views or not, it's a penetrating critique of U.S. energy policy and its history, at least since the 1970s. He's also the co-editor and principal author of The End of a Natural Monopoly, Deregulation and Competition in the Electric Power Industry, and his scholarly articles on energy have appeared in such journals as Energy Policy, the Cato Journal, and the Journal of Public Policy. So I welcome Dr. Grossman.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I have to tell you that I have a small neurological issue that means that the light bothers me more than it should. So if you see me looking down or blinking my eyes a lot, it's just this small matter. It's supposedly hereditary, but there are those who believe it comes from the fact that I've studied economics for too long. Now, let's see if I can figure out how to do this. Is that right? Yeah, the question of the day. What's the likely future of renewable energy technologies? And so I go to some famous thinkers, Niels Bohr, Mark Twain, Yogi Berra, who are all alleged to have said it's very hard to make predictions, especially about the future. And by the way, this is especially true in energy industry or energy predictions, which have generally been somewhere between wrong and completely absurd. And usually they're seen to be wrong a couple of years out. I wrote a piece in which I contrasted the predictions of doom with the predictions of cornucopia, both of which were so far removed from what actually happened in the world that it was quite striking and certainly should make one a little bit cautious about making predictions about energy policy or energy development. But I'm going to go out on a limb and say that yes, renewables are likely to be important to U.S. energy supplies in the future. The real questions are not if, they'll be when, how, and actually one that we'll get to soon is why. But let's go to the first two. When? Now, according to a lot of people, especially here. How? By government mandates and subsidies, and also feed-in tariffs and other kinds of ways of improving their prospects. But the why is a question that's never really answered. what is the actual goal of renewable energy policy? I shouldn't say it's never really answered. It's often answered in so many different ways that it becomes very confusing as to what is actually the interest in terms of accomplishment. And it often is a confusion of means with ends. In other words, we've got to develop something. Why? This started, by the way, back in 1972, before the embargo. In the Nixon administration, they said, well, we really have to think about energy. And so they went into a group was formed, and they came out with 70 different things we could do about energy. But they never answered the question of why we needed to do these things. But of course, there are goals. You can pick them. Some will say all of them. Some will say one or two of them. We'll run out of oil and gas someday. We need to cut emissions to prevent climate change. We want to keep energy affordable, so at least for now we'll make it more expensive. We just love wind, solar, biofuels. Technology is cool. By the way, this is a view that a lot of our presidents have had over the last 40 years. And we need energy independence, and renewables are the key. And thus, whatever we pick, we need to have government policy that pushes us in this direction. Now, we've been told, though, that we've been running out of oil, look at those goals, we've been running out of oil and gas since the 19th century. In the 1970s, there were very learned predictions that right now, here in 2014, we would have run out of oil at least a decade ago, and natural gas probably 25 years ago. We will, in fact, never run out of oil and gas, though we might reach a point when it gets prohibitively expensive. But I would certainly not want to stand here and tell you when that's going to happen. That would be a prediction that is almost certainly going to be wrong. It won't happen overnight. It'll probably unfold over decades, and it's a good argument for why we need R&D. If we want to cut emissions, intermittent sources of electric generation are a relatively poor way to go about it. Germany combines what I'm calling an Uber renewables policy with rising emissions. An RPS of 30% doesn't mean a 30% reduction in emissions, and may mean no reduction in emissions at all. Pricing carbon emissions. That's the only incentive that is likely to reduce them, but it's not politically feasible. And it would be hard for any officials to do this, and also we don't really know what the price should be. If you look at people pricing carbon, you find that they're all over the place. And then in energy independence. This is one of my favorites. I've counted at least 12 different definitions of energy independence that have been used over the years. I think there's many more. It's become a political catchword. Its meaning is ambiguous, and yet it has tremendous political traction. Everybody says it. I've been to places where the oil and gas person said we need energy independence. Somebody else from the renewable energy sector said we need energy independence, and nobody really tells you what that means or what it really takes to get there. This, by the way, is a lot of things about energy. The statements that are so common are often very ambiguous. Now, the actual goal, I think, for most policymakers is that they want to not have people make a fuss anymore. And so often these technologies are presented as panaceas. And there have been various panacea arguments over the years, or claims over the years, including that we could replace 20% of all heating systems with solar. That was in 1978. We'd be able to do it by the mid-'80s. Transportation fuels in 2007. That was the George Bush, Nancy Pelosi Lovin story. All energy would be solar by the year 2000, according to Jimmy Carter, and would all get this. By the way, this is sort of a standard energy independence time frame, 10 years. We'd get it in 10 years. If you look at the bills 10 years from now, there'll be energy independence. So that's what the politicians want. It's, by the way, beyond all of the election cycles. So 10 years is a very useful number. And of course, well, that's my question. But of course, if we can put a man on the moon, government should be able to produce a new energy paradigm, right? Well, I call this the Apollo fallacy. The Apollo project nor the Manhattan Project are apt analogies. As I wrote in an editorial once, how many people have had to choose between a trip to the moon or a trip to Paris? How many people have had to choose whether to use a nuclear explosive instead of the chemical explosives of similar yield? But with cars, for example, electric cars, we're supposed to make those choices ourselves. And the Apollo program was really not an apt issue at all. It was a demonstration project, and most renewable energy technologies, as we've heard, have not only been demonstrated, they seem to be working very well. Why do so many of the programmatic efforts by government to create new energy technologies fail? It's because political processes can't legislate technological ones, especially ones that are supposed to succeed in relatively free markets. And government policy and commercialization have had a very mixed history. In fact, I really don't have too many examples where it succeeded, but they've often retarded development, as they did with the nuclear power. That was really pushed by the government, and now no one trusts it. And solar hot water heating bankrupted the solar industry twice within 10 years and set it back a long way. But the government policy is, well, here are some energy panaceas through the years. Breeder reactors, solar by 2000, commercial fusion by 2001. These were passed. By the way, in that one, the Congress congratulated itself and said that it was the equivalent of the initiation of the second discovery of fire. Cellulosic ethanol in 1989 was said to be nearly ready and would be at 43 cents a gallon. The 80 cents is inflation adjusted. A family car would get 80 miles to the gallon. We spent about $2 billion on that. And Secretary Chu told Barack Obama that by now a range of car batteries would be 300 miles and would cost about $3,000. They were about 12,000 when he said that. I think they're about 12,000 now. The government's approach essentially says it happens because we want it. It's a demand-led story that really doesn't work. If it's technically feasible, that government support will make it commercially viable. The technology appears cost-effective. Adoption will be widespread. And none of these have been shown to be true. But if what really seems to be in their minds is if we legislate it, it will happen. And I have contrasting the field of delusions with Iowa's field of dreams, and said it's a sort of government statement, hey, that's a nice cornfield, let's turn it into a bad gasoline substitute. A couple of final points. Basically, markets are decentralized decision-making, and in general, we have all these different things about government's involvement at that level, but when a product is in the market and is something people find useful, it only goes away when something better comes along. With government, it disconnects all of the signals and all of the issues connected to the market. And when subsidies and mandates go away, so too do the technologies. And you know, a lot of people have talked about how all of the wind and solar are now cost competitive. Okay, I think that they should be in the forefront of demanding that subsidies be removed, so that we can get away from thinking about it as something that is the stepchild of government. But I do wonder why the wind industry is so vociferous about the fact that they really want a production tax credit. What happened to wind when they removed incentives and subsidies in Spain? And why do Germans pay 3 times as much for electricity as we do? So I think I'm pretty much at the end. So to answer your questions, when we actually need them, how, when they can succeed without, in the market, disconnected from the foolish belief that the commercial success can be legislated. There's some place for government, I want to say, with respect to energy, but current thinking is old thinking. It's been around for the last 40 years, and it's always been waiting for there to be the breakthrough that they'll create, and somehow it'll save their political position and our energy system. It hasn't worked. It's unlikely to work. It's not the way in which innovation and development actually occurs. Thank you.
Okay, we have a nice range of perspectives on the future of energy policy. We have the state, local, national, global perspectives, economic, technological perspectives. So I think we should open it up for questions. We have still about 25 minutes. And we have microphones. Yes, right there.
Yeah, what would a across-the-board investment tax credit, not picking who the winners are, not picking who the losers are, but just making it independent of what energy source you wanted, if you knew you had a long-term investment tax credit, it wasn't targeted for wind or solar or anything, how would that work as far as the industry goes, in your opinion?
Who is the question directed to? The panel at large? Okay.
Whoever wants to answer, and I suppose we can start with the people.
Is this on? Is this on? Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess I'd have to understand how that investment tax credit would work. It's certainly, the production tax credit was mentioned earlier. Production tax credit, and maybe this is where you're headed, is very key to the cost justification of wind. We pass along the production tax credits to our customers, and that's one reason we can keep rates low. But without the production tax credit, it would be very hard to justify wind at its current prices. So if you had production tax credit or some kind of tax credits across the board, it would more levelize the playing field perhaps among the resources, and I don't know how the economics would work out. Certainly, to get a permitted coal plant, you're not going to do this in the United States anymore. So, and nuclear is going to be very hard to build going into the future. So what have you got? You got natural gas, and you've heard this morning that people don't want natural gas built either. So I think economic-wise, it would level the playing field, whether I don't know exactly what would be built if that was available.
And I would add a couple things. Interestingly, the Senate Finance Committee Chairman Baucus last December, and then reinforced by the new chairman, Wyden. Baucus is now our Chinese ambassador to China. And he proposed actually simplifying these 40 energy tax credits that exist into 2. One for power, one for transportation. And the level of the tax credit would hinge on how clean, in terms of emissions, the technologies are, and the amount of the incentive would be set based on how clean that is. So that's interesting that that's out there. I think that it's unclear what it would mean in the market, but it certainly would level, and balance things out. To Dean's point, You know, the one thing is, I'd say, we're, you know, as a country, we're not neutral on energy, right? Energy is quite fundamental to everything. When I was at BP, we used to say, you know, energy is the basis for light, heat, and mobility, you know. So it's just too fundamental. So policy is going to be an important element of energy. We're not neutral on this. We care where it's developed. We care about supplies. You know, we care that it's there, et cetera. So the issue is, what is the most effective policy to, you know, to drive, you know, set the framework for the competitive playing field, to establish the market? What are the rules of the road? That's what we need to revisit. And I think even goes to your point, Professor, you know, about, you know, what policy is doing, and is it really, you know, driving things? I think that when we think about what independence and these other issues that I think notionally we can all figure out, we kind of get that as a public. That, and I think Dean, you put it probably most nicely, most appropriately, and it's typical. You know, when we see what utilities are doing and others, you know, you have a portfolio approach to make sure you have a fuel diversity. So I think that, you know, I think where we're at too going forward is to revisit energy policy. The problem is the practical level of politics. I think that's been talked about here this morning as well. So we're ready for a new debate, new technologies there, capital's there. You know, where do we go forward?
Just to make one point about the politics, every major energy bill that's been passed in the United States in the past 40 plus years has been in the midst of or in the aftermath of a crisis that colors the way in which these bills are created. They're invariably a total mess. Jimmy Carter even recognized this, only to do the most messy version of it himself. But in fact, it's very difficult to get any kind of energy bill that has a real impact, that will be something that can be agreed upon in a kind of dispassionate way. That's just the way this particular area works and has worked, yet we keep coming back to the same basic system, same basic motivation, and the same basic, the bills are usually, the centerpiece of the bills are usually the same. And that's some kind of panacea promotion. Last one was ethanol. And, but we've had this going on now since the 1970s.
One last thought, if you mind. And it's not a Democrat or Republican thing.
Right.
It's often a regional kind of theme. And what's more is, to get anything done in Congress, you need a coalition, a broad coalition. Hence, everybody gets something, and then it looks like, you know, it's a hodgepodge.
Right. What was it? John McCain said of the 2005 bill, it should be termed "No Lobbyists Left Behind."
Next question.
I have two questions for Mr. Crist. I'll try to make it very, very brief. The first question has to do with carbon pricing. Does Mid-American employ some sort of carbon pricing at its long-term planning? If so, how close is it to the federal social cost of carbon numbers that are out there? The second question is, to what extent is Mid-American familiar with and interested in Minnesota's value of solar approach to the valuation of the various benefits associated with solar?
Okay, thank you. On the carbon pricing, I can't speak directly to how we do factor in, when we look long-term, what might be happening in environmental policy, and we factor that into our very detailed 10-year plans. I can't speak to the exact level of price and how that might compare, but certainly that is one aspect when we look at market prices and generation and things like that, that we factor in what we think might happen in those policies, but I can't speak to the level. As far as the value of solar, you know, I think that has to do with a lot with the distributed generation inquiry that's going on at the Iowa Utility Board at this point. It may will continue next year and probably have a workshop around some of the financial aspects, so that'll probably be talked about at that time. We do think that that net metering needs to change, that there is huge cross subsidies for DG customers that are being paid by non-DG customers. If 25% of our residential customers went to distributed generation, I would need to raise prices to non-DG customers by almost 9%. So that's the issue we're dealing with, and we'll have that discussion with the Iowa Utility Board and where they go with that.
I'd like to thank the panelists. That your insight has been very helpful and very insightful. This question can be for really any of the panelists, but I'd be particularly interested in Dr. Grossman and Mr. Foley's response. What would happen if the PTC were available for solar, and how would that impact the viability of solar in your charts and graphs, and why shouldn't the PTC be available for big solar as it is for big wind?
Interesting, because the PTC is a performance-based incentive that is applied to your tax liability. So you have to make money to actually be able to use any kind of tax liability. But the PTC, is based on the amount of output power generated. The ITC is based on your capital investment, separate from the output. The PTC is allocated over 10 years. At right now 2.3 cents per kilowatt hour. The ITC, you take a 30% tax credit right up front. I think that's interesting, because there has been a lot of discussion about going to more performance-based incentives generally, but the ITC dates back to, I think it's 1994, and the Energy Policy Act back then, to drive capital investment. And back then, what's that?
92.
Or 90, actually, it's 92. He's exactly right, it's 92. 94, boy, big political year, a bit different scenario altogether. But it was the IT. I think it was the solar got that ITC at a time when the solar was very, very costly, and it was to try to get the capital into the sector. I do think now, and this is the discussion that's going to begin happening, it's already happening in Washington around tax reform, to the other question, looking at reforming our tax code generally, but including in the energy space very much so. What are the right carrots and sticks going forward in energy? And I think there actually what was proposed last year was pulling the ITC back a little bit, but not fundamentally changing it. So I think based on the cost competitiveness of solar, where it's at now, rewarding on performance, would work as well. There are some in our sector, because of the stop-start, that say we're tired of the stop-start. We'd rather have not at all. So actually, the renewable energy sector is not uniform on that. But that said, the conventional part of our energy sector, has permanent deep incentives that continue, and had them for 100+ years. And so you have these issues that that need to sort out in the market.
But Todd, I think that solar gets a tax credit now.
The solar gets
that will end in 2016, if I recall right.
Well, in the solar, it does qualify for the investment tax credit, and it does expire. It reverts in 2016 to the 10% permanent commercial tax credit for solar. It was in 2005 that President Bush and the Congress extended the ITC to residential solar applications, for homeowners for the first time. If you were a business investor in solar, you got the tax credit, but homeowners did not have a tax credit. And so it was extended to homeowners, and then in 2007 it was enhanced from 5%. They capped it at 5% and expanded up. And in 2016, without further action, the residential tax credit for solar disappears, and right now it's 30% for residential commercial. That for commercial reverts to 10%. So this is what I think, along with the general interest in tax reform, looking at the tax code broadly, that both parties or political parties are saying they want to do and have already started. Below that high-end issue is a very much a debate going on energy tax policy going forward.
I'm a little surprised that I was asked to be one of the people to comment on this, because obviously you probably would gather that I would be against all of these taxes and any subsidies, which is probably true. But basically, I was going to mention the fact that Mr. Foley, sorry, just mentioned about the fact that solar did have these tax credits. One should realize that what the government is doing is essentially redistributing, thank you, Peter, income. In other words, it's transfers from ratepayers to national taxpayers. People should be aware of it. It's one of those things that you don't really hear this, you know? It's not something that's in your tax return. It doesn't say, and so this much is going to go to ratepayers in Podunk.
I would just add that, you know, the tax code is all about economic and social policy. You know, the distribution of resources or to drive certain activities. So you know, the oil and gas depletion allowance is a driving of resource that direction from elsewhere. As are the but again, you know, this is the tax code in our society has been a huge tool to address all kinds of social and economic policy, poverty, home ownership, energy, you name it, right?
Next question.
This has been a very high-level discussion on policy and production and demand, and if we can for a minute, let's bring it down to the local level, which is where I work, and maybe a question for Mr. Crist is, what role does local policy play in achieving some of the goals or successes that you're aiming for?
Could you give me an example, or what do you mean by local policy?
Local government policy, whether it's you know, policy at the city or the county level to incentivize alternative or renewable energy.
Good point. You know, in Iowa, which I assume you're in Iowa here, you know, we have defined service territories that are state regulated, and we have to require and respond to state regulations on many things: safety, price, reliability, customer satisfaction, all those kinds of things. So that's the overall governing thing that we have to abide by. And then, you know, if there's local policies that can fit into that, then, you know, I'm not quite sure I understand what your question is, and maybe Dave Karras could help me out a little bit, but I think you know, it's certainly an input into the process, but we can't do anything that regulatorily we can't be allowed to do. I don't know, Dave, did you have anything that can help me out of here?
You know, obviously, I think some cities are getting into looking at what they can do to bring down some of these soft costs that were mentioned on solar in terms of permitting, those kinds of things. But I think you're just seeing cities get more and more active on that. Also, you know, you do have, you know, property or tax issues with cities. I know we have franchise fees tacked on to our bills in a number of cities, and it's possible that they could use some of those revenues to, you know, redistribute for renewables and that sort of thing. But we really haven't seen local governments get too involved yet in some of this stuff.
I would jump in. There are also incentives that come from Mid-American and other utilities for conservation at the local level. I, in fact, had a Mid-American representative come out and do an audit on our house about how we can reduce our energy costs. So that is one way in which this reaches the local level.
Appreciate you mentioning that. I also have energy efficiency, and I would encourage everyone in our service territory to take advantage of those programs, because if you think about it, the cleanest form of energy is one we don't have to produce. And Dave, thank you for, Dave's our Vice President of State Governmental Affairs for Mid-American. Thank you, Dave, for helping me out with that.
Next question. Do we still have a couple more minutes if there are other questions? How about over here? Yeah.
This question is for Dr. Grossman. I really liked your comment about the fact that nobody has really defined what energy independence means. And as you were talking, it occurred to me, well, maybe that's being done on purpose, that nobody wants to do that because then people are going to have to explain why they think that way. But who can be against energy independence? And I wonder if you could comment on, is that intentional that nobody's defining that because they don't want to define it, because then the people will pin them down?
Well, let me just say that some people do make a point of defining it, although they define it in ways that don't seem to be energy independent. For example, a congressman from South Carolina in the during the debates around the first Gulf War said that he wanted the U.S. to move toward energy independence, and then he said, and I define energy independence as not importing any oil from OPEC. Now, that would be an almost meaningless way of defining energy independence. It just would mean that there would be a transfer of oil from one country to another, and since oil is fungible, it would make really no difference. You never do see a made-in label on the gas you're putting in your car, and so I think that my own feeling, I think you might be right that some people do it to use energy independence as just a catchword that people respond to, and they're happy that they don't have to define it. But I think that it's what one political scientist called a higher order symbol. In other words, it means something to people, and that's why they respond to it politically. But in fact, it really has either no meaning or multiple meanings that make it entirely ambiguous, which makes it very effective for politicians to use.
And I think that's a good point. I think it does mean different things to different people, and it's hard to define it. But I think really it's about, and I think we all get this, about making sure that we have reliable, affordable supplies of energy. Right? I think thinking back to the Arab oil embargo, when we actually not only did, they cut us off from OPEC supplies, it caused prices to rise dramatically. We had no control over that at the time. We want to make sure we have a diverse supply, that we're no longer dependent on one source so that we can't experience those kinds of shocks. And I think, we also have to recognize, these are global markets for oil on the fuel side, and it's not a global market for power, but these are broad markets for the fuel sources. It is a global market for the fuel sources, often coal and gas and so on. And so the really issue is about American independence. Really, I think it means different things, but it is about making sure we have this balance, equilibrium of a diverse, portfolio of supply, so that no matter what happens, we've got reasonably priced to reasonable fuel sources.
And the new terminology that's beginning to displace independence is energy security, which is not the same thing as independence.
Maybe a better term.
Yeah.
If I may correct the historical record for a moment, and you can read more about it in my book if you'd like, but in fact the reason, first of all, it wasn't all of OPEC that embargoed us, it was just the Arab branch of OPEC, and in fact the other OPEC countries increased production so that they could sell more oil at higher prices. In fact, what the Arabs did with the embargo, they cut their own production, and so they wound up cutting their own revenues. The reason we had gas lines and so much trouble in the United States was not because of the embargo, but because we had both price and allocation controls that were so completely counterproductive that it led to effects that people then associated with energy problems. And even to this day, if you take a poll, especially of people who were around in the 1970s, they will say, yes, we expect at some point there'll be a cutoff of oil and we'll be sitting in gas lines again. Well, in fact, we've weathered a lot of different upheavals in oil-producing areas, and we haven't had any gas lines. And the reason why is because we don't have those controls anymore. Perhaps the most consequential energy policy decision in the United States was to abolish price and allocation controls in the 1980s.
I think we have time for, maybe I have time for one more question, and if you want to follow up on the last question to the panel, so that's fine, but let's take one more question. Yeah.
So this is a quick question for Mr. Foley. You talked about master limited partnerships. Iowa has a tax credit, Iowa 476C, which is designed to encourage and support community-owned wind farms, well, renewable energy projects in general. As you understand master limited partnerships, do you think that tool would lead to more community-owned wind projects or more utility-scale investor-owned projects?
Haven't given, my quick reaction is that MLPs are probably not going to have a differing impact. With the MLP market is made available a huge pool of lower cost, more liquid capital for those sectors that it can apply to. So if you applied it to wind and solar and other things, I think you would have this pool of capital that can be more easily and cheaply deployed. Whatever the area might be, whether it's a utility scale or a community. The community utility scale issue is a function of another kind of a policy framework, because in places like Iowa and others, you've got a regulated monopoly where you're not allowed to have these compete against the incumbent utility. So those rules would have to be changed to allow community solar to go forward. But I do think that it would, access to MLPs for renewables would aid utility scale deployment as well. It would make available to Mid-American and others, developers, a much larger source of more liquid, low-cost capital, which, goes to, gets very much to the cost.
Any final thoughts from the panelists? If there are remaining questions, you can maybe corner them during the break, but I'll give them one last word. Okay, let's thank this panel, and we're scheduled for a short break, I believe, right?